session. Um, Let me try one more thing. Just put this in. And hopefully this map is visible and useful. It's at an odd angle. It's showing the route that the Crusaders took from Europe into the Holy Land. This is Asia Minor, modern Turkey. When the Crusaders finally came out, Antioch is right here. Um, it's the first major city of what we would consider to be the Holy Land. The city that they saw was absolutely terrifying. Terrifying in the sense of how could they ever possibly take this city? It's surrounded by walls that run in a circuit of 7.5 miles. On one side, it's bounded by the river Orontes. On the other side, I'm going to go with a different map here. The river Orontes runs to the west of Antioch. There are two mountains that are within about 1.5 miles of the river. City walls run right along the river. They cross the river, and then they go up the sides of both of these mountains, Mount Starin in the north and Mount Silvius in the south. And if that weren't quite enough for anyone trying to take the city, a citadel was then built virtually on the highest point of Mount Silpius. And that citadel looked down from over 1,000 feet on the city below. If you're familiar with The Lord of the Rings, the White City, Minas Tirith in the Kingdom of Gondor in the third part, that's something like what Antioch would have been. A huge city with huge walls that run then into a mountain, then run up the side of the mountain, and then there's a citadel that stares down on the city from 1,000 feet above them. This is the city that the Crusaders stood in front of and basically had to take. It had been occupied by Turks. The Turkish people that appear in this story require a bit of explanation. When I'm discussing the Crusades, I'll generally refer to the Western Christians as the Franks, because that's how their enemies saw them. The French people so dominated the First Crusade that the term in Arabic for crusader is simply Ifranj, that is the Franks. Because we have to distinguish them from a local Christian community that was there that was both Greek Orthodox and different Eastern rites, including Armenians and Syrian rites, some of which were in communion with Rome, some of which weren't. When I refer to the enemies of the Crusade, I'll describe them mostly as Saracens. Saracen is a kind of useful word because it doesn't really have a good technical definition today. It's just one of those words that we kind of use when talking about the enemies of the Crusaders, which makes it very useful. Um, the Islamic empires, kingdoms, and provinces that the Crusaders fought against um, were not homogeneous. In some places, the local population was Arab. In some places, the local population, such as in North Africa, was Berber or various African tribes. In Turkey, there were the population itself was actually mostly Christian, including Georgians, Armenians, and Greeks. The Turks that arrived ended up being the warlords that were in charge of them, but they were most definitely not Arabs. So to describe the Crusade as Westerners versus Arabs is deeply misleading. To describe them as Muslims also doesn't help because that's not quite specific enough. And when we look at the armies that they fought, to describe them as Muslims implies a level of religious cohesion that usually just didn't exist. Um, some of the population was Muslim, some of the Arabs were Christians. Some of So we had different Muslims that some were not Arabs, some were Turks. We had different Arabs, some were Muslims, some were Christians. It's a very mixed up population. And adding, various ethnicities of Westerners into all of this just made it more confusing for everybody. So the blanket term of the Franks is useful because it kind of implies French, but not in the way that we would understand it today. And the blanket term Saracens is useful because it implies mostly non-Christian, which is basically how the Crusaders saw the various groups of people that they were going up against. The Turks, the country that is now Turkey, is not their original homeland. Originally, the Turks were basically like second cousins of the Mongols. They were a steppe people that lived in the Eurasian steppe, that huge, high, dry grassland that runs basically from Eastern Europe all the way across to Korea. The Mongols were at one end of that. The Turks were basically in the same area, but they came to prominence before the Mongols did. While the Mongols were still very small, bickering tribes at the eastern end of the steppes, the Turkic people established a brief empire that stretched all across Asia for about 100 years between the 5 and 600s. Then, as Islam expanded with Arab conquests in the early 600s, eventually they came into contact with the Turks. And then one of the more fascinating migrations in human history happened. As the Arabs became incredibly wealthy from their conquest of the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Sassanid Empire, which were two of the richest civilizations on Earth at the time. As this happened, the Arab population became accustomed to wealth, and they also became accustomed to fighting each other for the leading roles in the cities, provinces, being governor and whatnot. And the situation of infighting in the realm of Islam in the 7th, 8th, and then 9th centuries got to be so bad that the leaders no longer relied on simply Arab troops to be loyal to them, because there were so many different Arab leaders looking for the allegiance of the soldiers and willing to pay them this, that they came up with a solution that sounds insane. But it worked out for several hundred years. Rather than have to rely on Arab soldiers that could be bribed by other Arab leaders, they ended up buying slaves, training the slaves as soldiers, and then having those soldiers who were slaves and had only known this master be loyal to them personally. And this is how the Turks come into the Arab world in the first place. Some are bought as slaves right at the border of the realm of Islam and the realm of the Eurasian steppe. And then they form these armies that are personally loyal only to one specific leader, whether that is the Caliph, who is at this time had been in Damascus, is now in the new city then of Baghdad. But because they had nothing to do with Arab society, they couldn't be easily bribed by other leaders. And the Turks brought in a new form of warfare, which was incredibly effective, just as what the Mongols would do 500 years later. The Turks were light cavalry. They were outstanding horsemen. They were outstanding archers. Um, and they lived in a world in which essentially every Turk was a soldier. And their method of warfare was so exceptional at the time that basically every provincial governor who didn't want to lose his lands to neighboring provincial governors fighting for more land ended up having to have these groups of Turkish slaves, or at some point in time, Turkish mercenaries. Because when the Turkic tribes saw just how much money the Arabs were spending on slaves, they came to a conclusion very quickly that these were definitely people that they could raid. And originally, they would just do raids into Islamic lands, um, capture women and children as slaves, capture booty, take it back to their lands. But very similar to what the Vikings did in England and France at almost the exact same period in time, some of them realized that rather than just doing these raids, they could kind of just set up shop and make themselves the warlords over these areas. So different tribes of Turks start coming into the Islamic world. And as they come into the Islamic world, they end up converting to Islam, and they also end up developing some of the Arab Persian culture that marked the world of Islam in the 9th and 10th centuries. Um, but then, as these Turks had picked up some of the Persian Arab culture, um, they they weren't quite as they found themselves as governors, needing to have a new set of soldiers that they could command. Because when they were just a war band, the way that a war band works is you have a chief, the chief has the followers expect the warlord to lead them on constant raids and constantly distribute money to them. If you've read Beowulf, the world of Beowulf, in which you have a leader and you have his followers, the followers expect to go on constant raids and expect their leader to constantly enrich them and honor them publicly. It's the exact same world of these Turkish warlords. Um, as the Turks end up becoming the governing powers in the cities of what's now Eastern Iran, they end up having to settle down. And the way that you can govern a war band is not exactly the way that you can govern a functioning city. Um, some of the Turks that they brought with them as followers end up getting kind of high roles in this new Turkic government, but some of them aren't really interested in settling down. So then a third group of Turks end up coming into the world of Islam. These are referred to usually as the three groups that we have. The slaves are Mamluks. Mamluk is just the Arabic word for slave. Then you have the Turks, who are sort of the early adopters of Islam slash Arab Persian culture. And then this third group are the Turkomans, which they have adopted Islam. They haven't adopted Arab Persian culture. They're still sort of the wild nomadic Turks that want to go around raiding, and they picked up a particular form of Islam that is it's referred to as Ghazi, which is holy war. The idea within Islam originally, there's no the idea of countries and states don't exist. The idea is that the entire world is going to be converted to Islam, and there will be constant conflict until that happens. Um, that was a worldview that the Turkomans were completely willing to embrace because it meant that they got to have constant fighting, constant raids, constant enriching themselves with every group that they came up against that was not already Muslim. Um, so these are the three groups of Turks that basically take over the Islamic world, not the entire Islamic world, but the world that stretches basically from what's modern day Syria all the way into Afghanistan, Pakistan. This world's taken over by the Turks in the 10th and the 11th centuries. Now, when I say it's taken over, it doesn't mean that that entire world becomes Turkic. Um, they just put themselves in charge. They leave the existing governments in place. For the most part, they leave the bureaucrats in place. There was a Arab Persian tradition of governance that had established itself in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, parts of what's Pakistan. That was very functional, and the Turks realized we weren't real that they're not really interested in setting up new governments, so they just left that government in place. They just made themselves warlords and put themselves in charge of all of this. So it's a very small number of Turks that basically have all of the military control and a fair amount of the political control. There is still a caliph in Baghdad who is Arab, who has very little control. They started losing control as soon as they started buying all of these Mamluk slaves, because the Mamluk slaves very quickly turned the caliphs basically into puppets. This is the Turkic Islamic world that takes over what is now Syria, um, parts of what's now Turkey, all of Iran, all of Iraq, and is starting to make inroads into what's now Israel and even parts of Egypt in the late 11th century. Um, the Turks have just taken over Antioch itself in 1085. Um, the First Crusade is called in 1096, and I won't get into that because that's an entire lecture on the history of the calling of the First Crusade. Um, but it's only 11 years after the Turks have established themselves in the city of Antioch. And when I say the Turks have established themselves in Antioch, what I mean is there's a Turkic governor there, Yagi Sion. Um, he's got a Turkic army with him. Some of them are his personal followers. Some of them are these Turkoman nomads. Some of them are Mamluk Turkic slaves. The population of Antioch itself is what it had been traditionally, which is this Byzantine population that are basically the descendants of the Eastern Roman Empire. Most of them are Christian, but some of them are Greek Orthodox. Some of them are Armenian rites. I'm trying to distinguish between Catholic and Orthodox at this period for reasons I can explain. Isn't overly helpful either. It doesn't make sense to think of distinct churches in the way that we would today, except for a few of these groups. Um, the Armenians and the Greeks, when it comes down to the question of local populations, peasant farmers in Syria aren't really engaging in high level debates about the nature of Christ. The bishops are very interested in that. And that's what they've been doing in the East for, at this point for 700 years. But for the average peasant farmer, the question of Greek versus Armenian is a question of ethnicity. Um, And it's also, if you're an Armenian, it's the knowledge that you're being told what to do and you're having to pay taxes to a Greek rather than an Armenian, which generally doesn't make anyone particularly happy. So as these cities have gone back and forth between the control of Byzantium or the Eastern Roman Empire over into the Islamic Caliphate, into the Islamic Caliphate that's now controlled by Turks, back to Byzantium for a while, for the local population, um, there wasn't necessarily a huge change. Their tax rates might change, but their day-to-day living was basically the same. Their job was to farm and create agricultural taxes for whoever was in charge. Because if you're one of these conquest groups, whether you're Byzantine, whether you're Arab, whether you're Turks, the last thing that you want to do is kill all the farmers in any land that you conquer. The whole point of conquering the land is so that you can enrich yourself from it. And if you kill the farmers, you're literally killing the source of the wealth for the region, and therefore the whole reason of taking it in the first place. So you have this population in Antioch that is mostly Christian, but it's very used to being bounced around between different foreign powers, none of which they really identify as their own group of people. Uh, then we'll make it even more interesting reviewing the Turkic situation in Antioch, and this is what the Crusaders faced, and then I'll talk about the Crusaders themselves for a minute. For a brief period in time that runs from about 1055 to 1092. So a little less than 40 years, there is what we can call this Great Seljuk Turkic Empire. Um, and it runs across all of Iraq, all of Iran, Syria, parts of Turkey. It's led by a couple of different men who take the title Sultan. And Sultan is kind of just a generic word for leader. This was the title that the Turkic warlords gave themselves. In the traditional Islamic system, there had been a caliph, and the caliph literally means deputy, and they were traditionally understood to be the people holding the chain of command from Muhammad himself. When Muhammad died in AD 632, and a huge question that the early Islamic community had is how do you possibly replace him? He wasn't just a prophet, he was also a general, he was also a lawgiver, he was also uh, a judge. I mean, he was basically a one-man society in leadership. Um, they recognized nobody could actually replace Muhammad, so they took the title of Caliph, but in the person of the Caliph was invested all ultimate authority, with the assumption that nobody would actually be able to run everything in society. So this person, the deputy, would then delegate everything out. Uh, of course, when the caliphs started bickering and fighting with each other, and then they had to start getting these slave armies, the slave armies very quickly pushed them to the side and made themselves kind of figureheads. When the Turks came in and conquered Baghdad in 1055, they actually kind of restored the caliph to some power, but he was now restricted as a religious figure. They took the title for themselves of Sultan, which made themselves something like a secular slash military leader, although the term secular there barely works, if at all. But for a period then of almost 40 years, there had been a series of three sultans that managed to run a very effective empire. And they did this with the help of a vizier, another title that they invent in this time. Um, and I'm going to try to share a map here, hopefully. Not sure how effective this is just with the glares that we're getting. I think in the future, I'll just take pictures and try to put these on slides. Um, but this whole area here had been the Great Seljuk Empire until 1092, when everybody who was in charge of it dies. The Sultan himself was Malik Shah, who was the grandson of the Sultan who swept in and had taken Baghdad in the first place. Um, he was the military commander. The civil government itself was almost completely in the hands of changing the layout here to see if this is any better. Um, the secular government, the actual administration of taxes, censuses, roads, things like that, was in the hands of a Persian vizier coming out again of that Persian bureaucratic tradition that goes back to the Achaemenid Empire, um, King Cyrus and whatnot. And Malik Shah had basically run this entire empire from a bureaucratic administrative standpoint for about 30 years. Um, Part of how he ran it was trying to insist on one particular form of Islam, that is Sunni Islam. Islam's divided into two groups, the Sunnis and the Shia. The Shia have always been the minority population. And Nizam al-Mulk persecuted the Shia because the Shia within Islam have always been um, a revolutionary sect. So those who are disaffected and upset with the current government situation have always been attracted in this period until about the 1500s to Shia Islam. And the most famous revolutionary group of the Shia is the group that came to be known as the Assassins. A small group of even by Shia standards, religious fanatics, fully willing to embrace their own death because Shia Islam embraces martyrdom more than any other religion. Since they were a small persecuted sect, they couldn't take on the Seljuk army. That was out of the question. The solution that they came up with was to fight an asymmetric warfare that was based on targeted assassinations of significant figures. The first significant figure that they went after was Nizam al-Mulk, who was essentially this one-man government for this entire Turkish empire. When he died, control over the empire slipped. Is that better or worse? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Okay. Neither one of this seems to be very effective. We'll just go with slides in the future. Uh, and of course, once the single central administrator dies, there's the concern of all of the local groups wanting to splinter off. Nobody likes to take orders from anybody. And if you are part of a huge empire and the one figure holding the empire together dies, this might be a great chance for you to assert local authority. Right after Nizam al-Mulk is assassinated, the Sultan Malik Shah dies. In the Turkic tradition, two traditions here that will guarantee succession crises throughout this entire period. Number one is having multiple wives plus concubines, which guarantee lots of sons. And number two is sharing land and possessions amongst those sons. So when the Grand Sultan and the Vizier die, there is no effective central authority anymore. All of his sons and brothers now, because of course he has a ton of brothers as well, all male relatives believe that they now have a claim to power, and they all seize it. And we'll notice this area here, the Holy Land, the Levant, is shaded between the two groups, the Great Seljuk Empire and the Fatimid Empire in Egypt. The Fatimids I'll talk about in one of the other lessons. but they're both fighting over this land. And as they're fighting over this land, which the Turks kind of have the upper hand in, the Turkish central administration dies. Sons of Malik Shah and brothers of Malik Shah start declaring themselves princes of their own territories. Yagi Sion, who was put in charge of Antioch, was in theory the vassal of one of Malik Shah's sons, Dukak. Dukak was in charge of the city of Aleppo in Syria, um, which Antioch is up on the coast. Aleppo is more or less due east of that. The other great city of Aleppo, of Syria, is Damascus, much farther to the south of Antioch. That was so we had Antioch, Aleppo, and Damascus. Damascus was in the hands of Dukak's brother Ridwan. Ridwan and Dukak, of course, hated each other. They were brothers who were competitive and each thought that they should rule all of Syria. Yagi Sion was then in a position where he owes allegiance to a brother who's busy fighting another brother, and therefore doesn't really have to listen to either one of them because both of those brothers would like to have his support. And then, meanwhile, all the way up over here in the city of Mosul, which is on the Tigris River in northern Iraq, um, we have one of the other relatives of Malik Shah that comes to power, but isn't strong enough to rule for himself. So the power there is in charge of a Turkish figure called an Atabag, and that is Karabaga. Karabaga will be the one that rides out after the Crusaders have taken the city of Antioch. Karabaga is going to be the one who puts together a huge alliance to try to drive out these Christians, but really with the idea in mind of making himself lord of this entire area from Mosul to Antioch to Damascus and possibly further south if he can. The Christian army, the Crusader army, the Franks that they're facing, this is an army, and here on this map, it's showing where the major areas of recruiting for the Crusades were from. This red color is areas of major recruitment that sent huge numbers. Orange is sort of in between. Yellow is low numbers. And you can see most of who goes is in what is now France, hence the Franks. The Crusaders that heeded the call of Pope Urban II, and again, that call would be discussed in a separate lecture. They were grouped in four major armies. And the major armies were led by princes, princes of some importance, not kings, not the most important men. The most important political leaders in Europe at this time are all having their own squabbles so that none of them want to go. The Holy Roman Emperor is involved in the investiture controversy with the Pope, and that still has not been patched up, hence the low recruiting for the Crusades in Germany. The Holy Roman Emperor refuses to even acknowledge Urban II as the Pope at this point in time. The King of England is now William II, William Rufus, who is still working on putting together a fully functioning country after the invasion of 1066. 30 years to get your complete country in order isn't necessarily enough time. The King of France can't go because the King of France was excommunicated at the exact same council that the crusade was declared because the King of France was having an extramarital affair with one of his count's wives. So who ends up going? Um, the major groups are led by the four princes, one of whom is Godfried of Bouillon, who is the Duke of Lower Lorraine. So this area in here. His brother Baldwin comes with him. They have an army. It's been estimated that they had maybe 15,000, 10 to 15,000 total people with them. That would have been maybe a couple hundred knights, but mostly foot soldiers. Um, After Godfried Bouillon, and Godfried will end up being elected king of Jerusalem when everything is said and done. Um, Another major group is put together of these would be the Franks. It's not under the leadership of any single dominant personality. I'll refer to them as the Roberts. Um, Robert, Duke of Normandy, and Robert, Count of Flanders. Normandy is this area here to the west of Paris. Flanders is part of part of the Netherlands, and I think part of it is in Belgium. Flanders was incredibly wealthy in the Middle Ages because it was a huge cloth production center, and cloth production was by far the most valuable industrial output that there was. Normandy was one of the richest areas in France, and the Duke of Normandy at this point in time is realistically more powerful than the King of France. Robert is the son of William the Conqueror and the eldest son. So when William the Conqueror came over in 1066 and basically won all of England at the Battle of Hastings, his eldest son received the Duchy of Normandy as his inheritance, and the second son received all of England. So just to show you what the population centers, where the wealth and money was at the time, the Duchy of Normandy was seen as being more valuable than all of England. The brothers did not get along particularly well. Robert of Normandy was a very good soldier, a very good commander, a very poor administrator, and did not get along with his brother, and actually ended up spending the final, I think, 20 years of his life imprisoned by Henry I of England. So things kind of went downhill for him after the Crusade, we can say. And then the third major figure that's associated with this group of the Franks is Stephen of Blois. Blois appears here on the map, just south of Paris. Stephen of Blois is married to Duke Robert's sister Adela. One of the things about the Crusades is that those who took up the cross tended to be part of family network groups. It's not like this was a random call that Europeans individually responded to. It was something that there were Crusader families. The Crusaders as families went, and this ended up spanning the generations. So Robert of Normandy goes, his cousin Robert, Count of Flanders goes, his brother-in-law Stephen of Blois goes. in that first army, Godfried of Bouillon, who's the Duke of Lorraine, his brother Baldwin goes with him. Um, and their relations in this area. Interestingly enough, Godfried is the second son of his family. The eldest son is Eustace. Godfried leads his own army. Eustace doesn't. Even though Eustace is the eldest son, he does not get the Duchy of Lower Lorraine. He is the Count of Bouillon. Bouillon is, I, I believe it's in modern Belgium. Um, the eldest son is made Count of Bouillon. That's Eustace. Eustace goes in the same group with the Roberts. Um, all of this, I suppose, to say is if there's any hope of making the Crusade something straightforward about like landless sons of Europe going to get fame and something straightforward like that, it doesn't work. Most of the basic ideas that we have about the Crusades and how it functioned are just demonstrably false. It was incredibly complicated. European politics were complicated. They all had multiple reasons for going, but the biggest reason for all of them was sincere devotion. To suggest that anybody gave up their life in Western Europe, put together the amount of money that crusading took, and crusading was incredibly expensive. Um, it suggested that a knight had to basically come up with the equivalent of 4 years' income in order to be able to afford crusading. Um, by definition, crusading wasn't something for poor landless sons to do because they had nothing in Europe. If you had nothing in Europe, you couldn't afford to go on a crusade just because of the expense. I mean, think of the expenses involved um, just in getting food and water to spend 6 months walking from Belgium to the Holy Land. And now, if you're a knight, being a knight is incredibly expensive. The horse, I mean, horses today are expensive to maintain. If you were a medieval knight, you had to have at least 4 horses. You had the one huge war horse that you rode to battle, but those weren't horses that you wanted to travel on because they weren't really good travel horses. You had at least 3 horses for traveling with. Um, and you also had, you would have somebody who's there just to assist with your weapons. You'd probably have a couple other adult male soldiers with you. This was insanely expensive. Nobody in Europe who was broke and looking for economic opportunity went on a crusade. They couldn't afford it. What we do have in the records are people literally mortgaging their entire lives so that they could go on a crusade. Godfried of Bouillon, in order to be able to afford this, literally signed his patrimony over to the Bishop of Liège. Liège is the city here. Um, if he came back, he would get his land back. The Bishop of Liège would get all profits for all of his land the entire time that Godfried was gone. And if Godfried died, then that land would go over to the Bishop of Liège. Um, most of the people that we know about who actually went on crusades, we know about them because of the formal documents they have in which they're mortgaging their lands in order to get money so that they can afford these crusades. So that's 2 of the armies, Godfried and the Roberts. The third army is that of Raymond of St. Giles. Raymond is the Count of Toulouse down here in southern France. He is the oldest of the major princes. He was probably 60 years old. He probably puts together the largest army. It's been suggested between 15 and 20,000. And he absolutely has the attitude that he deserves to be the leader, not just of his own army, but of all of the princes that go. The fourth leader, who ends up who ends up as the hero of most of the First Crusade. He was by far the best field commander. But he ends up sort of being painted as the bad guy in a lot of the histories for being greedy and not that religious. All of the princes that went, if you want to, you can find examples of them being greedy and not as devout as you'd like them to be. But the fourth leader is Bohemond of Taranto. Um, Taranto is here in the heel of the boot of Italy. Southern Italy, likewise, had just been conquered by Normans. Um, the Normans at this point in the 11th century were basically just conquering everything that was available. They conquered southern Italy starting in the 1030s. They conquered England in 1066. They had a huge presence for the early Reconquista in Spain. And Bohemond was the elder son of Robert Guiscard. Robert Guiscard had successfully conquered southern Italy from the Byzantines. The next step was that Robert Guiscard was looking at conquering parts of the Balkan Peninsula, starting in Dyrrhachium or the city of Durazzo. And that was going to be, since it was far richer than southern Italy, that was going to be the inheritance of Bohemond of Taranto. Robert Guiscard died. Bohemond was not able to finish the conquest. And this is in conquering southern Italy and this land here that is now parts of Albania, Macedonia. He was fighting against the Byzantine Empire. Uh, so delightfully enough, and he had fought actually against Alexius I, who was the Byzantine emperor. He defeated Alexius twice in battle and then lost the third. And the third battle was the one that ended up costing him basically everything. Bohemond didn't have the title that the other three leaders had. His army was the smallest of the four major armies. It's been estimated at around 4,000 or 5,000. And again, he's kind of been painted as the greedy, irreligious villain, which is an unfair historical assessment. But that's something that we can get in, that I'll get into later in the course. These are the four major armies that composed the First Crusade. They all took different routes to the east, but they all met together in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and then they all marched together from Constantinople through the highlands of what is now Turkey, and then into the Holy Land and into the city of Antioch. The road from Constantinople to Antioch was awful. They were nearly destroyed near the city of Dorylaeum almost immediately into their march as they went through Anatolia. I had mentioned the Turkomans. The Turkomans were the group of kind of the wild nomadic Turks that didn't want to settle down and run cities. They wanted to have their nomadic kind of pillaging ways. And they found that what is now central Turkey was outstanding. It was really good pasture land for their horses. The Byzantine Empire was not able to defend it after 1071. And so they kind of just turned central Turkey into their own Eurasian steppe, which consisted of driving off almost all of the peasant farmers, which meant that this entire area in this period was in a state of anarchy. What peasant farmers there were fleeing because the Turks had no interest in really taxing them, because the Turkomans weren't really that interested in creating an empire. So when the Crusaders marched through this land, there's roving bands of Turkomans who are very interested in killing them all and taking their money. There is not an agricultural base that they can get food from, and the Turkomans start poisoning wells after losing the Battle of Dorylaeum. So it takes them months to march through this, and it's an absolutely awful experience that all of the crusading diaries describe in terrible detail. possibly 20% of the Crusaders die of starvation. Almost all of the horses die. Uh, Whatever land would have been good for horse pasture, the Turkomans destroyed so that it wouldn't benefit the Crusaders in any way. There's arguments about who should be in charge of this. Raymond of St. Giles, Raymond, Count of Toulouse, had seen himself and believed that he had been picked by Pope Urban to be the leader of the crusade. Pope Urban absolutely did not pick a secular leader. Pope Urban had put the crusade under the leadership of Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy. Bishop Adhemar was close to Raymond of Toulouse, but because Bishop Adhemar was seen as the leader of the crusade, that did not mean that Raymond then had some special status. And the other leaders saw no reason why Raymond should be in charge. When they get to Antioch, then, and they get to Antioch in the fall of 1097, they had left Europe in 1096. They set out. They set out from Constantinople in late spring of 1097. When they finally get to Antioch, Yagisian in Antioch has heard reports of these Frankish soldiers, which originally they thought were just mercenaries of the Byzantine Empire. The Saracen notion of who the Crusaders were and what they were for is very confused. The Byzantine Empire had been employing mercenaries for several hundred years, including Vikings that were known as the Varangian Guard, including Normans. Some of Bohemond's family members fought against him when Bohemond was fighting the Byzantine Empire. His family members had been mercenaries in the employ of Alexius and the Byzantine Empire. So the Turks had kind of just assumed that this was a huge mercenary gang. They weren't really sure what to do. But Yagisian is hearing the reports as the Crusaders go through Turkey, that this is a much larger army than we've seen before. This is something different. So Yagisina basically ejects all of the Christians from the city of Antioch because he's afraid that they will betray him. He starts persecuting local Christians, the rural farmers. And the rural farmers are going to be 90% of the population everywhere on Earth at this moment. You have cities like Antioch, but however many people might live in Antioch, there's going to be 10 times that population in the surrounding farmland, making all the food that a city like Antioch eats. Yagisina starts persecuting this population, who will absolutely remember this when Antioch falls. He turns the Cathedral of St. Peter, again, St. Peter's association with Antioch. It's one of the sees that was founded by St. Peter himself. He turns St. Peter's Cathedral into a stable for his horses. So desecrating the cathedral to try to make some kind of point. I'm not sure exactly what kind of point he thought he was making, but desecrating religious buildings very rarely works out well in history. So this is what Antioch looks like. This is the circuit of walls, and the whole thing should be squished in together by about a third. I've spread it out just so it's easy to see. These are the walls that run along the river Orontes that go across up into Mount Starion on the north, and then Mount Silpius, which is the eastern border of the city of Antioch. The high point of Mount Silpius, coming just down from that, is where the citadel is built, and the citadel looks down on the city 1,000 feet below it. It has 400 towers along the walls, so that every step outside the walls is within bowshot of one of these towers. When the Christians come up on the city, We don't know how large the army is. Um, the the best guesses are that it's about half the size of the army that had left. Um, 60,000 was the number that was thought to have left, but that also includes civilians. And we're not sure how many civilians were involved. Some people brought their families with them, some pilgrims came along. But the guesses for the siege of Antioch is that in September of 97, maybe 20 to 30,000 of those are available, in awful condition, of course, because that march through Turkey was terrible and took a huge toll. When they get to Antioch, it's fall, the harvest is in. They are able to eat well, they are able to rest. However, they do not have enough soldiers to completely surround the city. The walls are deeply impressive. They don't have siege works. They don't have siege towers, which are like moving platforms that are 50, 60 feet high that you can then push up against the wall, and allow your troops to come down. They don't have those. They don't have catapults. They don't have mangonels. They don't have anything that they can batter the walls with. Um, if they were to try to take the city, it would literally be thousands of soldiers trying to knock through a gate without battering rams or trying to climb walls, perhaps with makeshift ladders. Um, if they had been successful, it would have been at a huge cost in soldiers. The army that Yagisina has inside of Antioch is much smaller, 5,000 at the absolute most, but it's more than enough to man the towers against the Crusader army that doesn't have siege equipment. Um, when they set themselves up in September, they come out of the mountains. By October 20th, they've put themselves around the city of Antioch itself. Count Raymond suggests that they should do a full attack right now. The other leaders tell him no, and they set down for a siege. And the plan is that they are just going to starve Antioch into submission, which is how walled cities are usually taken in the Middle Ages. Defeating walls is incredibly difficult. Simply starving a city, because almost by definition, a city cannot feed itself. Cities require constant food supply to come in from the outside. The outside, number one, are Christian farmers that now hate Yagisina because he's persecuting them. Also, the Crusaders are out and they're eating all of that food themselves. The problem that the Crusaders have is that Antioch has several gates, and the Crusaders do not have enough soldiers to block all of the gates. The southern gates, known as the Bridge Gate and the St. George Gate, are left unguarded. In between the two mountains is there's a small creek that runs in between the two of them, and there's a gate here. That gate, known as the Iron Gate, is they can't there's nothing they can do about that because that sits in between two mountains. To come close enough to try to stop any traffic at the gate, you're within bow range because the defenders are not just up on walls, but they're on walls on a mountain looking down. So the Crusaders, the Franks are not able to really starve out Antioch. However, Yagisina can't survive forever like this, just getting some supplies in through these gates. The only way you can defend yourself against a siege is for a relief army to come and help you. The two feuding brothers, Dukak of Aleppo and Ridwan of Damascus, they both end up sending armies and trying to relieve the siege. Both of those attempts are unsuccessful. At the end of December, there was a combined mission of Bohemond and Robert of Flanders that intercepted the army of Dukak. It was a bloody fight. mostly because you had a single army with multiple commanders. And it was hard for the Crusaders to effectively engage the Saracen army with multiple commanders. Um, so the lesson that they learned from this is whenever they engage the foreign army, they have to have one single commander. And Bohemond is the one that is then decided by the other princes to be the commander in chief when they're actually engaged in the field. Um, this was determined after he had saved Robert of Flanders. Robert of Flanders' army was at the lead of this foraging party and was about to be completely destroyed by Ducac when Beaumont came in with a charge and literally just saved the day with his fighting and, more importantly, command abilities. Uh, the very day that that happens, there is a severe earthquake in Antioch. Uh, Earthquakes in biblical cities are going, especially during a religious war, are going to have more significance than they ordinarily. At this point, the bishop Adhemar of Le Puy starts to create cohesion in the army. He institutes, and this is just remarkable. You have an army that, as we're getting into late December, the food's disappeared. They've eaten all of the harvest. They've eaten everything around. These two leaders were off on a foraging campaign because they ran out of food. So as the food is starting to get lighter and lighter, Adhemar of the Puy institutes a 3-day fast. And the Crusaders, who are running low on food, voluntarily fast out of religious devotion. They start having public prayer. They start having large religious ceremonies together. Um, it was reported at the time that he ordered the fast that already one person was dying of hunger every 7 days. It's hard. I can never get past that fact that as people are literally dying of starvation, a voluntary fast is called, and the Crusaders embrace that. It's a kind of faith that I don't think we encounter very often. But this isn't enough to this, the fast itself isn't enough to actually change the situation. The situation continues to deteriorate. Another army is sent out on the 8th of February. Bohemond hears that Ridwan is coming with his army. Bohemond takes soldiers and sets up a successful trap that Ridwan falls right into. He destroys this army utterly. And after this, it's very clear that Bohemond is clearly the leader of this in everybody's mind except for Raymond's. Raymond of Toulouse still believes he's the person who should be in charge, and having that kind of dissension between the two leading princes doesn't really help things out. Reinforcements arrive, food arrives. There are ships from Genoa, there's ships from England that appear off the coast. Bohemond's nephew Tancred is able to take the city of Alexandretta, which is the closest coastal city to Antioch. Again, this helps, but they're still not able to take the city itself. In late April, they hear news that Carbaga, the leader of Mosul, is putting together a huge army. That something he doesn't use the term at this point in time, but something close to jihad is being called, that the Muslims are uniting in this idea that we have to get rid of these Christians. He gets his own soldiers from Mosul. Baghdad sends soldiers. Ridwan and Ducac temporarily stop squabbling with each other. They send. It's estimated he has an army of 35 to 40,000 soldiers that are with him. This will be enough to absolutely destroy the Crusaders if the Crusaders are caught outside the walls. On the 29th of May, when Carbaga is about a week away. Bohemond goes to the other princes and says, I have a plan. If I can take the city, will will you acknowledge that I am the authority? The other princes agree to this. Bohemond, who speaks Greek fluently, is able to communicate with some of the members of the garrison in Antioch. Um, they had mercenaries who were Armenians, and some of the Armenians spoke Greek as well. And Bohemond was able to get some of them to basically betray their side, open up one gate, allow the Crusaders in. And once the Crusaders had that small opening, that was really all that it took. 60 soldiers go up a ladder, go in through this spy's window. It's actually very similar in description to how the Hebrews end up taking one of the cities that's described in the conquest of Canaan. Um, from there, they're able to take two towers. Once they have two towers, they're able to open a gate, um, and the city falls within about a half an hour. And this happens the night of between the 2nd and 3rd of June. They're able to get themselves put into the city of Antioch for all of 2 days before they get news that Carbaga has reached the Iron Bridge. The Iron Bridge is north of Antioch. It's where the River Orontes bends around, and the River Orontes does a loop around Antioch on its way out, and it flows down. The Iron Bridge is a few miles north. Carbaga has reached the Iron Bridge. From there, you can just see Antioch. By the 7th of June, with his army of 35,000, he has Antioch completely surrounded. Also, the Crusaders were not able to completely take the city. The remaining garrison fled to the citadel. The citadel itself is, again, 1,000 feet above the city. It has its own independent set of towers and walls. And so now the Crusaders have a couple thousand Saracen soldiers in the citadel. They've got 40,000 of Carbaga's soldiers around the city. There's really no help of relief coming. They had hoped that Alexius was going to arrive with an army. The original idea is that the Crusaders were going to be joined by Alexius, and Alexius the Emperor was going to lead the armies in their attack on the Holy Land. On the night of the 2nd of June, hours before the city falls, the Crusaders are terrified for their lives. Some of them flee. One of those who flees is Stephen of Blois. Stephen of Blois actually encounters Alexius and his army on Stephen's way back to Byzantium. This is in the middle of June, and he convinces the emperor that the city has to have been completely lost and that there's no point in going. Alexius, because he has to deal with the Turks throughout Asia Minor, if the city's already lost, he can't afford to risk himself and his army in this land. He heads back to Constantinople. So there's no hope of the Byzantine army coming and helping them. And on the 14th of June, when it looks as though things have completely fallen apart, I'm sorry, on the 10th of June, it looks as though things have completely fallen apart. There's no army that can come to help them. There's a huge army outside. There's a sizable army in the citadel. There's no more supplies. They're down to a couple hundred horses. Men are starving. They have people climbing out of the city and trying to flee to save their lives. On the night of June 10th, a peasant comes to Count Raymond and Bishop Adamar. His name is Peter Bartholomew, and he recounts to them that he has been having visions for the last 7 months. The first vision came on the night of the earthquake, December 30th. This is why he remembers it. And he asked the vision who it was. The vision replied, I am Saint Andrew. You are to tell the bishop that he needs to do a much better job of spiritually ministering to the faithful. And you need to tell Count Raymond to go into the Basilica of St. Peter. And at this point in time, the vision takes him into the city and shows him a place in the Basilica where he says is buried the Holy Lance, the spearhead used by the centurion Longinus that pierced the side of Christ during the crucifixion with blood and water then flowing out. Peter refuses to act on this. He's a peasant. There's no way he'll be admitted. Remarkably similar to what Juan Diego tells Our Lady at Guadalupe 500 years later. I'm a peasant. They're not going to possibly listen to me. How can I ask for an audience with the bishop? He gets another vision in February, on February 10th. On February 10th, he's not in the city of Antioch. He's out foraging in Edessa. St. Andrew comes and tells him, why have you been ignoring me? God is protecting the Crusaders. The saints in heaven are longing to fight with you. Go and speak to the Count. Peter thinks about it at the time, but by the time he gets back to Antioch, the effect wears off and he's back to, I'm a peasant. They will not listen to me. On March 20th, the vigil of Palm Sunday, he is with a man named William Peter, who seems to have been his master. He's a peasant. He's attached to somebody wealthier who seems to be this William Peter. They're at St. Simeon, which is a port that is south of the town. And St. Andrew insists again, you need to go and tell them, and you need to tell Count Raymond that when he is at the River Jordan, this is what he is supposed to do. Peter tells this to Count Raymond, and he tells it to Bishop Adamar. Bishop Adamar does not believe him. Much like Bishop Zumarraga's response to Juan Diego at Guadalupe, now that I think of it. It's an ignorant peasant. Why is the ignorant peasant having visions? And especially a vision, the very first vision we need to remember. Peter was told that he needed to criticize the bishop for the way he was spiritually ministering to the Crusaders. That probably was not going to inspire much credence on the part of Bishop Adamar. But Raymond of Toulouse, for whatever reason, is willing to listen to this. 4 nights later, he decides we will do an excavation of St. Peter's Cathedral in Antioch. They spend all day digging in the spot that Peter Bartholomew indicated because it's the spot he says he recognized from the vision on December 30th, which is before they were in the city. Now, of course, he's recounting this afterwards, but he claims to have received the vision and the location before he'd seen the cathedral with living eyes. They're not finding anything. They're about ready to give up. Peter jumps into the dig site himself and spots something. He doesn't pull it out himself. This is recorded by Raymond of Aguilers, who was part of Raymond of Toulouse's company and wrote one of the chronicles. And this chronicler says that he himself saw in the dirt this piece of metal sticking out. They take it out, and this is what Peter Bartholomew claims that he saw in the vision on December 30th as the Holy Lance. Now, what we'll notice is the Battle of Antioch is on June 28th. It's not as though they pulled out this piece of metal and everybody immediately accepted it. And all of a sudden, the Crusaders were filled with belief and energy. It's 2 weeks before they decide to actually do the attack. So one of the ideas about the Crusade is that also, and it's generally an idea about the Middle Ages, that they're simple people with great faith who are willing to believe in anything. And that's just not the case. If you look at the things that people believe in our world today, there's no way that people in the Middle Ages were any more credulous than we are. Um, but in a time like this, one might be willing to trust faith a little more. By the 28th of June, and again, it's 2 weeks after this has been discovered, Bohemond goes to everybody and he says, look, we can't stay in here forever. We will all die. We must either fight or die. We are greatly outnumbered, but we need to take our entire force. We need to send them out and we need to attack this army directly. Um, he's able to get the agreement eventually of everybody. He then is able to organize, and this is Bohemond's fantastic leadership abilities. Um, he's able to get everyone else to agree with him that we need to do this. He divides up the army into 6 divisions. The first is that of Robert of Flanders, the Roberts, also with Hugh of Vermandois, who is the brother of King Philip. King Philip couldn't go on crusade because he was excommunicate, so his brother did. They were that, and here they're marked as Hugh, which is why I'm bringing him up now. Godfried of Bouillon is in the second group. Robert of Normandy is in a third group over here that's not labeled on this map. The fourth would have been Count Raymond's army, but Raymond was ill at this time, so he stayed behind with a force of 200 and guarded the citadel just so that no one could come out from the citadel, because again, there were still Saracen soldiers in the citadel. And then Bohemond and his nephew Tancred are in the 5th and 6th divisions coming up at the edge. They march out of Antioch. They march over the bridge gates. Kerbaga has some of the emirs that he's assembled, this coalition that he's assembled, saying, let's go get them right now. Kerbaga doesn't want to have a victory over just part of the army as they're coming out, because Kerbaga believes if he just destroys this first group coming out, then the rest will stay in Antioch and he'll have to fight them. Kerbaga wants to have a decisive battle of annihilation and destroy them all. So he allows the entire Crusader army to come out. And then once the Crusader army comes out, he has a small force that had been hiding on the other side of the mountains that comes around. He has a position, he has a good defensive position set up for himself. The soldiers are marching towards him. If he just has patience, he can force a much smaller army to attack him in a strong defensive position that he's chosen. And while this is going on, he has a smaller force that has looped around and is trying to catch them in the rear. Bohemond was expecting this. Bohemond knew what their strategies were. That's why he put himself and Tancred at the back. They peeled off and engaged the encircling force. Kerbaga, at this point in time, loses his nerve. He feels that he has to do something decisive. He doesn't want to just wait for the soldiers to approach him. So he breaks his strong defensive position. He sends some of his army towards the Crusaders to engage with them. All the while that the Crusaders were marching, they were having to endure arrow fire because the Turks are primarily horse archers. So they're marching towards the Turks' defensive position, and the Turks are showering arrows on them. Once Kerbaga sends part of his army to go attack them, he has to stop all of the arrows. Bishop Adhemar is leading Raymond of Toulouse's soldiers, and Adhemar has the Holy Lance with him. it's ironic that the one person who refused to believe in it at first ends up guiding the army in which it's being carried. And the Crusaders are in, from a Christian standpoint, a very clear and simple position. They have to win or die. And given the idea of crusade, that fighting for Christ, and we'll get into what that means later, but just for now, fighting for the purpose of freeing the Holy Land from the infidel. Anyone who died died as a martyr. So the Crusaders were in a position here where they weren't anxious to die, but if they die here, they die in a glorious charge and they die a death of martyrdom. They fight with absolute cohesion and absolute bravery. One of the Turkish tactics is what's called the feint retreat, where you'll have horse archers run up and then they'll turn around and flee as though they're in flight. And it's very useful because when soldiers see the enemy turn and flee, it's very difficult to restrain the urge to run right after them. And if you're horse archers and you can get infantry breaking their ranks and running after you, you can now pick them off one by one. They try one of these, but the problem of a feigned retreat is that it actually looks just like a real retreat. And if you don't have great battlefield communication, or if your soldiers lose their nerve, a fake retreat can very quickly become a real retreat and a debacle. And that's exactly what happens. As they do their feigned retreat, the soldiers stay in their position and continue to engage, and the Crusaders do. This isn't a single army that the Turks have. Again, Karabaga has put together a coalition, and it's a coalition of people that don't trust each other. They don't view themselves as one great single Islamic army. They view themselves as the armies of Mosul, the armies of Damascus, the army of Aleppo. Some of these decide this isn't worth fighting for. Some of them actually begin to flee because they see the Christian bravery and they don't want a part of it. And they run right into the main army itself. And when that happens, the main army scatters almost immediately. Within 2 hours, an army of 40,000 has fled in front of an army that could not have had more than 15,000 soldiers chasing it. Every single emir, every single individual Saracen leader that had joined Karabaga abandons him that very morning. Karabaga sees the rout, sees the confusion, sees how the Crusaders are fighting, and he himself flees. The Crusaders have completely taken the field, and by that evening, they're cutting down stragglers of the Turkish army, and they found the Turkish camp, and they are taking all of the supplies, riches, and wealth that was there. When they began this fight, they were divided about the Holy Lance and whether or not it was authentic. But what all of the chronicles report afterwards is that during the battle, they became convinced that they had the real Holy Lance. There were multiple reports of visions of St. George in particular, who was a Greek saint. St. George was not a Western saint originally. St. George was a Greek saint. The southern gate of Antioch is the St. George Gate. Multiple crusaders in different armies independently reported seeing visions of him fighting with them in the clouds. And by the end of the day, what began as a suicidal march ends up being the most significant victory and possibly the most significant moment in the lives of these crusaders. The crusade goes on, of course, because the goal wasn't Antioch. The goal was Jerusalem, which it will be another year before they take Jerusalem, because even though they've had this incredible moment, human nature reasserts itself and the squabbling returns almost immediately. Um, but this is one of those moments that historians greatly struggle with. Uh, Later, Peter Bartholomew will be challenged. He will be called a fraud. Um, he will openly be accused by priests of having invented the entire story. And this is where, if the story was kind of unsettling before in the way that you cannot make sense of it logically, and you can't, it gets even more so. Peter Bartholomew insists that he have the opportunity to defend the truth of what he said with a trial by fire. Two fires of cedar wood, 13 feet long and 4 feet high, are placed a foot apart from each other. And Peter Bartholomew takes the lance and wants to walk between. He insists on this. Um, he's horribly burned. He comes out at the other end with third-degree burns over his entire body. He'll last for 12 days and die in absolute misery. Some of Raymond's supporters will say that he actually passed through, and he did. He didn't die in the middle of the fire. He did pass through the fire. And some of them will then turn that story into he passed through it and he was fine, but then the crowd rushed him and pushed him back into the fire, um, which to me is very much rings of a justification after the event. Um, but the fact that he insisted upon this himself means that he was willing to test with his life. With his life, he was willing to show that he absolutely believed in the truth of his visions himself, and that he was willing to die horribly uh, to be proven a liar. After this, most of the Crusaders consider him to be some sort of fraud. Or rather, they consider the Holy Lance not to be an authentic relic, because of course those are two very different statements. Raymond of St. Giles continues to keep it and continues to treat it as a relic. Even after the events of the ordeal by fire. But the fact that Peter Bartholomew insisted upon this to defend the truth of his claims is something that there is no simple explanation for. And that's tonight's story, I guess. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah. Hi, it's Rich. Can
Hi.
you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear and see you.
Oh, okay. I'm here with Suzanne. Well, of course, you answered the main question right at the end, maybe answered at the beginning, but you answered at the end. And I was thinking, I'm not a history expert or anything, but I thought First Crusade, Jerusalem. And I was thinking, well, why are we spending an hour and a half talking about Antioch? And at the very end, of course, said, well, that comes a year later. So I know the other crusades did not end as well, the later crusades.
Yeah, there was never the success of the First Crusade. Although, if we want to be technical about it, which of course that's what I love doing, let's be technical. Um, the First Crusade came in three parts. The first and third parts were absolute failures, with everyone being butchered. The second part, what we consider to be the First Crusade, is what's usually referred to as the second wave. Sometimes the first wave is referred to as the People's Crusade, and it's presented as though it was just like ignorant peasants, which it wasn't, but calling it that makes it easier to deal with. After Jerusalem was taken, there was a call for more crusaders because it's one thing to take Jerusalem, it's another to hold it. The original idea seems to have been that, and this was all instigated by the Byzantine Emperor Alexius. He had called for help. The original idea that all the crusaders seem to have had is that they were going to march to Constantinople. The emperor was going to then take up leadership of this army with as many soldiers himself as what they had all brought. And then they were going to go down to Jerusalem, and then Jerusalem would end up being part of the Byzantine Empire again, as it had been up until 636 when it was taken over by the Muslims.
Ah,
Um, when that doesn't happen, I mean, the First Crusade is remarkable. Just like everything in it ends up being a remarkable story one way or another. I picked this one just because it's the kind of most unnerving story, I think. Uh, the capture of Jerusalem is way more straightforward. Um, and there's a lot to discuss, but it doesn't have this aspect of absolute despair, a moment of faith. We're not sure exactly what the faith that we have is in. Um, and then we're not sure what to do with it afterwards, which is just what I love about the story of Antioch is that it's so human. Uh, a lot of the stories that we get have been purified of all of the doubt and uncertainty, and unfortunate details kind of get written out so that we can have a much smoother, less conflicting narrative of God helps, there's triumph, and everything is wonderful. Very few stories end up being like that when you look at them in any depth. And I think, I mean, I understand why they wrote the stories the way that they did. They wanted to inspire people. Um, but I think
sure.
there's something, perhaps for our age, it's better to emphasize the human frailties and the doubt.
There's
Not
two
not doubting
other,
that something isn't
yeah.
true, but not knowing how this can possibly work out for the good. Uh, that's what I liked really about this particular part.
Yeah, I mean,
And
it's
it
a
ends up,
great story. I mean, as far as a story, it's a fascinating story. The other sort of large aspect of this from my background, whatever you want to call it, is somehow these crusades turn into the Knights Templar and the cathedral in Malta and all the
right, the
all
temple,
of this other stuff that just seems to
hospitals.
come afterwards, but it all seems to have originated in, I don't know if it originated just in knighthood itself or originated in the Crusades, but seems to go on for centuries after that.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Um, and the way that I'm planning this class is there's a couple of lectures that are just kind of like introductions, like a brief history of violence in Christianity, I guess would be something like that. Starting with the martyrs of ancient Rome in the Colosseum. Or not the Colosseum, but the various arenas of the Roman Empire, especially the martyrdom of Saints Perpetua and Felicity, because we have Perpetua's prison diary. And the way that she describes what she's doing, um, she describes it literally as a combat against the devil in which she wins by being vanquished. It's just absolutely remarkable.
Hmm.
Uh, and so you have this phrase, the militia Christi, the soldiers of Christ, the army of Christ, that for a very long time was a metaphor. St. Paul uses that metaphor all the time. You know, you have to put on your armor. Um, and then it stops being a metaphor.
Yeah.
And so my training is as a medievalist. And as a medievalist, it, I can't remember who said this, but they said there's two subjects that you stay away from: Joan of Arc and the Crusades. Because when you read the books about either Joan of Arc or the Crusades, they're going to drive you insane. just because those are the two parts of medieval history that no one can even come close to being objective about. Um, and so, for either one of those, you can either be like a complete novice. I'm going to find this book. I'd like to read this one book. I'll get what I can out of it. Or you can dedicate a life to it, a life to it. But anything in between is
Oh my
just going to
gosh.
infuriate you. So, of course, I have to include both of those in a course.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fabian.
Appreciate it.
Thank
Okay.
you.
All right.
I hope to see you in a month or whenever.
All right. Good night.
Okay, night.